I thought the worst thing about that evening would be the seating arrangement. I'd spent 40 minutes choosing between the black cocktail dress and the midnight blue one, finally settling on the blue because Daniel always said it matched my eyes, and I wanted to feel beautiful and confident walking into that room full of strangers. I had no idea that by the time the appetizers arrived, my husband would be sitting 3 feet away from the woman he had supposedly left behind years ago, his face the color of old ash, and that the secret she carried into that dining room would detonate everything I had spent 4 years building. The woman's name was Victoria Marsh. Well, Victoria Caldwell now, apparently. And she was Daniel's ex-wife, not an old girlfriend, not a college fling. His ex-wife, the one he had told me about exactly twice. Once when we started dating, in the careful, neutral tone of someone reciting a fact about the weather, and once on our wedding night when I had asked him directly whether there was anything unresolved between them. "Ancient history," he had said, pressing his lips to my temple. "She's in the past, Clara. You're my future." I had believed him. I had believed him with the wholehearted, slightly embarrassing certainty of a woman who has never had any real reason not to trust her husband. I wish I could go back to being that woman. I wish I could warn her. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where all the quiet, ordinary moments live. The ones that seem like nothing until suddenly they're everything, until you're sitting in your car in the parking garage at 2 a.m, replaying every single one of them and thinking, how did I not see it? How did I not see any of it? Daniel and I had been married for 4 years when the Hartwell dinner happened. 4 years of early Saturday mornings when he would bring coffee to bed without being asked, of inside jokes that had grown their own complicated mythology, of small fights about dishes and big conversations about children and mortgage rates and whether we wanted a dog. We lived in a house that I had technically bought before I met him, a narrow Victorian on the east side of the city with bay windows and creaky radiators and a backyard that flooded every spring, but was absolutely perfect every other month of the year. It was my house in the way that mattered most. I had found it, I had saved for it, I had spent 2 months negotiating the price down while working 60-hour weeks as a project manager at Harlow and Associates. My name was on the deed. My name alone, no one else's, in clean black type on the first page of the title documents that lived in the fireproof box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. Daniel had moved in 3 years ago after we got married, and he had made it his home in all the ways that counted. His books lined the shelves in the study, his running shoes sat by the back door, his particular brand of chaos lived in the kitchen drawer where he kept charging cables, expired batteries, and takeout menus from restaurants that had since closed. The house smelled like his coffee and my candles and the faint ghost of paint from the bathroom renovation we'd done the previous spring. It smelled like us, like something built slowly and deliberately, the way good things get built. He worked in commercial real estate development, and his business, Caldwell Group, which he'd named after his mother's maiden name long before we met, had been growing steadily over the past 2 years. Good years, he called them. Really good years. He said it with a quiet, earned satisfaction, and I believed that too. We weren't rich, not by any stretch, but we were comfortable in a way that felt genuinely earned, and I was proud of what we'd each built separately and together. I was proud of the way we operated as a unit. 2 people who had made a deliberate, considered choice to share a life, and who mostly, day after day, honored that choice. His business partner at Caldwell Group was a man named Richard Hartwell, whose family had been in property development for 3 generations, and who had a habit of hosting what he called private business dinners at his house, evenings that were half networking event, half audition. You came, you met the right people, you ate Richard's wife's osso buco, and if you made the right impression, deals happened, relationships deepened. The architecture of business grew a new room. Daniel had attended several of these before. Solo. This was my first time coming along. "It's a good sign," he told me in the car on the way over, his voice warm with the specific pleasure of a man who feels his life is moving in the right direction. Richard doesn't usually invite spouses unless things are going well. He had squeezed my hand over the gear shift. "It means we're family." I remember thinking that the word family felt warm and specific when he said it. I remember the radio playing something soft, a jazz piano piece I didn't know the name of, and the city lights blurring past the rain-wet windows like watercolors, and the smell of his aftershave, and my perfume mixing in the warm car interior. I remember feeling genuinely uncomplicated, happy. I want to hold that moment like a photograph behind glass, fixed, protected, preserved, exactly as it was, because everything after it is fractured. The Hartwell house was a large colonial on a quiet street that whispered old money through every detail. The iron gate, the gravel path that crunched softly underfoot, the amber light pooling from tall windows onto the wet front steps. There were perhaps 20 guests when we arrived, standing in small clusters with wine glasses, the murmur of polished conversation filling the high-ceilinged entrance hall. Richard greeted us at the door, a broad man with silver hair and the easy confidence of someone who has never needed to prove anything to anyone, and introduced us to a few people whose names I immediately began to lose track of. Daniel was relaxed beside me, his hand warm at the small of my back, working the room with the practiced ease of someone who understood these events fluently. Who to approach, when to listen, how long to stay in each conversation before moving on. I stayed close, watching, learning the choreography. The sitting room before dinner smelled of wood smoke and something floral, a large arrangement of white peonies on the sideboard, and the light was the particular warm amber that expensive rooms always seem to have, the kind that makes everyone look softer than they do in daylight. I accepted a glass of champagne and let myself settle into the evening, asking questions of the people I met, sharing the correct minimal amount about my own work, performing the social contract of the business spouse with what I hoped was reasonable competence. Daniel was nearby but not hovering. We were doing well. We were, I thought, a good team. It was somewhere around 30 minutes into the evening after I drifted toward the window to look at the rain-darkened garden outside and accepted a second glass of champagne from a passing tray that I saw Daniel change. He was standing near the fireplace, mid-sentence with someone, and then his eyes moved past the person he was talking to, and something simply went out of his face. Not dramatically, not in the way people collapse in films. It was subtler than that. A small extinguishing, like a candle catching a sudden draft. His shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly inward. His hand, which had been gesturing lightly as he spoke, stilled at his side. His jaw tightened by a fraction. I noticed all of this from across the room with the particular hyper-awareness of someone who has spent years learning one person's body language down to its finest vocabulary, and my first instinct was that something work-related had gone wrong. Some difficult client, some deal quietly imploding in the background of this cheerful, well-lit evening. I followed his gaze. She was standing near the entrance to the dining room, speaking with Richard's wife. She was tall, with dark auburn hair swept back from a face that was objectively, neutrally beautiful in the way of someone who has always known they are beautiful and has long since made a practical peace with it. She wore a dark green dress, cut simply and expensively, and the kind of understated jewelry. A single bracelet, small earrings, that costs more than it looks like it does. She was laughing at something Richard's wife had said, and her laugh was easy, musical, real-seeming. Everything about her seemed easy. Everything about her seemed assembled with the same precision and intention as a well-structured argument. You could tell, looking at her, that nothing about her presence in this room was accidental. I didn't know who she was yet, but I knew, with the specific cold intuition that settles somewhere beneath the stomach and doesn't announce itself, that whoever she was important, that she was the reason my husband's face had just done what it did. I started making my way back toward Daniel. He saw me coming, and there was a brief, almost surgical rearrangement of his expression. The tension smoothed, the color returned to his face somewhat, and by the time I reached him and slipped my arm through his, he was nearly himself again. Nearly. If you didn't know what his face looked like at rest, you might have thought nothing was wrong. "You okay?" I said quietly, keeping my voice light, leaning slightly in. "Of course." He kissed my temple. It was quick, too deliberate. The gesture of a man reminding himself to perform normalcy. I didn't push it. We were guided into dinner. She was seated across the table and 3 places to the left. I learned her name when Richard stood to make introductions before the first course. Victoria Caldwell, recently joined as head of acquisitions at Hartwell Properties. He made a small joke about poaching the best talent, and everyone laughed with the comfortable ease of people who know they're meant to laugh, and Victoria smiled. That assembled precisely calibrated smile. And for just 1 second, no more than a second, her eyes traveled down the table to Daniel and then returned to Richard, smooth as silk drawn through a ring. If you weren't watching for it, you would never have caught it. I was watching for it. Daniel introduced me to the table. "My wife, Clara," he said, and his voice was steady, carrying the right note of warmth, and his hand found mine under the table and held it, and I thought, this is fine. This is the kind of thing that happens. People have complicated pasts. People run into those pasts at dinner parties. This is the sort of thing that is briefly uncomfortable and then it's over, and you go home, and he tells you all about it, and you both laugh a little, and it becomes a story you tell years from now. I held that thought through the soup course. I held it carefully through most of the salad. And then Victoria began to speak in earnest. She spoke about the Hartwell Properties acquisition pipeline, about 3 major projects in the northern quarter of the city, about mixed-use development and the particular challenge of historic district zoning. She was smart and specific, and the table leaned toward her as she spoke, that physical tell of people who are genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. At one point, she said, almost offhandedly, the kind of offhand that isn't offhand at all, that has been calibrated to sound casual while landing with precision. "Of course, I spent several years working adjacent to residential development before I moved into commercial, so I understand the owner-occupier sensitivity quite well." A brief pause. A small sculpted smile directed at no one in particular. The emotional attachment people form to property. How complicated it can be to disentangle the personal from the financial when circumstances change. She wasn't looking at Daniel when she said it. She was looking at Richard, but there was something in the words, a pressure, a specific shape they made in the air, that made the back of my neck feel cold, as if the sentence had been constructed to mean 2 things at once, and only one person at the table was meant to hear the second meaning. Under the table, I felt Daniel's hand, which had been resting gently on my knee, very slowly withdraw. The dinner lasted nearly 3 hours. I performed well, I think. Asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, managed the particular social work of being a spouse at a business event with the competence I'd built over years of professional networking. But underneath, something was pulling tight, like a thread being drawn through a needle's eye, thinner and more taut with every course, every carefully neutral word Victoria spoke, every time I caught Daniel not quite looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. The deliberate avoidance of something is still a relationship with it. I understood that by the time the dessert plates were being cleared. After dinner, Richard moved the group toward the sitting room for drinks, and the party broke into smaller conversations, people drifting and regrouping in the easy, slightly loosened way of the end of a good evening. I excused myself to find the bathroom, navigating through the corridor toward the back of the house, and when I came back, I stopped because I could hear voices from the room just ahead. The small library off the main corridor, where the door was half open and a thin blade of warm light fell across the hardwood floor. I recognized both voices immediately, in the way you recognize them before you process them, somewhere in the body before the brain. "You should have told me you'd be here." Daniel's voice, low, controlled, flattened to an evenness that I recognized as the specific register he used when he was working very hard not to show how rattled he was. I had heard it twice before in our marriage, once when he received bad news about a deal, once during an argument about his mother that neither of us had quite resolved, that particular flatness. Why? So you could arrange not to come? Victoria's voice, in contrast, was smooth, almost conversational, carrying just a trace of private amusement. Not the amusement of someone who finds things funny, but of someone who finds things predictable. "It's Richard's dinner, Daniel. I work here now. Did you honestly think I would simply cease to exist because you moved on?" I pressed my back against the wall of the corridor, my heart pushing hard and steady against my ribs, my champagne flute cold and forgotten in my hand. I was aware of the absurdity of my position, standing in the half-dark of a stranger's hallway, listening to my husband. but I was more aware of the absolute necessity of staying still and not moving. "This isn't the place," he said. "No," she agreed, easily. "But it is the time, because things have progressed further than you seem to realize, and you're going to need to make some decisions." A pause, during which I heard the soft sound of her setting down a glass. "She doesn't know about the arrangement, does she? The full arrangement?" It was not a question. Her voice was quiet and precise and utterly without mercy. "She doesn't know any of it." Silence, the kind of silence that is its own answer. "I thought so," she said. "You have until the end of the month, Daniel. After that, the documentation moves forward, regardless of what you've told her or haven't told her. I want you to understand that clearly." I heard her heels, measured and unhurried, moving toward the door. I stepped back fast into the shadow of the alcove behind me, and she passed without seeing me. Head slightly lifted, expression composed, trailing a scent of something cold and expensive, like the air inside a jeweler's case. She rounded the corner toward the sitting room and was gone. I stood in the dark with my back against the wall and my pulse filling my ears with a sound like distant water, and my mind trying to locate the edges of what I had just heard. What arrangement? What documentation? What end of the month? The sentences were syntactically complete, but semantically hollow, placeholders for something I didn't yet have the context to understand. And underneath the confusion, underneath it, colder and cleaner and more frightening, was the knowledge that there was a context, that there was something I didn't know about my own marriage, my own husband, my own house, that a timeline existed somewhere which did not include me, moving forward with or without my knowledge, and that the countdown had, apparently, already started. I stayed in that alcove until I was certain Victoria was well into the sitting room. Then I breathed. Once, twice. I looked down at my hands, at the slight tremor in the fingers holding the champagne flute, and I made a decision, quiet and specific. I would not show him anything. Not tonight. Not until I understood what I was dealing with. Because I had seen something tonight that I needed to understand before I confronted it. And I had learned, somewhere in the accumulated experience of 4 years with Daniel, of being a woman who worked in a field that rewarded precision over instinct, that the most dangerous thing you can do when you've received incomplete information is to react before you've completed it. I finished the champagne. I smoothed my dress. I walked back into the sitting room with the expression of a woman who had simply been to the bathroom and back, and I smiled at Richard's wife and laughed at someone's story about a sailing trip gone wrong and stood next to my husband for the last 40 minutes of the evening with my hand in his, and my mind working quietly and relentlessly behind everything I showed him. In the car on the way home, he turned the radio on almost immediately. He asked if I'd had a good evening. I said yes, lovely, and asked about one of the other guests, a developer he'd spoken to during the cocktail hour. He answered at length, animated back to himself, or performing himself, I was no longer entirely sure which, and we had a perfectly normal conversation all the way home, rain tapping against the windows, the city passing outside like a world that had continued unchanged while something internal had shifted irrevocably. We got home just after 11. He went upstairs. I said I'd be up in a moment and stood in the kitchen with the lights off, in the dark that smelled like his coffee and my candles and the faint paint ghost of our bathroom renovation, and I felt the ground under me lose its solidity in a way I had no framework for. Because nothing like this had happened to me before. I had been through disappointments, through difficult years, through the ordinary grief of ordinary losses. But I had never stood in my own kitchen in the dark and thought, I do not know what is happening in my own life. I do not know what the man upstairs knows and has chosen not to tell me. I do not know what I will find when I start to look. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside my husband and listened to him breathe, the slow, even rhythm of someone apparently untroubled. And I looked at the ceiling and I thought about the word arrangement and the phrase end of the month and the way he had gone silent when she asked if I knew. And somewhere in those small hours, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning when the house was completely still and the rain had finally stopped and all I could hear was the radiator ticking its old familiar tick, I made a different decision. Not just not to show him, but to find out everything, every document, every conversation, every layer of whatever had been built without my knowledge in the house that bore my name. I would begin tomorrow, and I would be very, very quiet about it. I started with his office, not immediately, not that first morning when he was still in the house and the risk of being discovered was too high. I waited. I made coffee. I handed him his cup and asked if he'd slept well, and he said yes, fine, and asked if I wanted him to pick up anything on his way home. And I said no, I'm good, and kissed him on the cheek at the door and watched him drive away from the front step with the expression of a woman who has absolutely nothing on her mind. The moment his car turned the corner, I was already moving. His office was a converted bedroom at the back of the house, my house. With a solid oak desk I had helped him carry up the stairs 2 years ago, bookshelves along one wall, and a filing cabinet in the corner that he'd always kept unlocked, because, as he'd said when he first moved it in, "I don't keep secrets from you." Those words had a different weight now. I stood at the cabinet for a moment with my hand on the top drawer and breathed, and then I opened it. Most of what was inside was what you'd expect: invoices, lease agreements, correspondence with contractors, planning permission applications for the Caldwell Group's various projects. I went through it systematically, the way I worked through project documentation at Harlow and Associates, methodically, without skipping pages, checking dates. 40 minutes in, I found the first thing that made me stop. It was a letter, printed on Caldwell Group letterhead, dated 8 months ago. It was addressed to a company called Meridian Bridge Capital, and it described the Caldwell Group's plans for a commercial development project in the Northern District, a mixed-use complex, retail ground floor, 12 residential units above, with an attached asset schedule listing the collateral offered to secure bridge financing. The collateral listed was not Caldwell Group assets. The collateral listed was a residential property at an address I recognized immediately, because it was the address of the house I was standing in. My house. Offered as security against a loan of £680,000, without my name appearing anywhere on the document as a consenting party. I sat down on the floor next to the filing cabinet with the letter in my hands and read it 3 times. Then I sat there for a while and did not read anything. The radiator ticked. Somewhere outside, a car passed. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed its low, indifferent note. He used my house as collateral, without telling me, without my signature. I got up. I went back to the cabinet. I kept going. The picture that assembled itself over the next 2 hours was worse than anything I had imagined standing in that corridor the night before. The Caldwell Group had not been having good years. The Caldwell Group had, 18 months ago, taken on a development project that had gone catastrophically wrong. Planning permission denied at the county level, a contractor dispute, a key investor pulling out. The company was carrying significant debt, over £400,000 of it, and the Meridian Bridge Capital loan had been the attempt to bridge the gap, to buy time, to keep the whole structure standing, while Daniel found a way to right it. He had offered my house as security for that loan. He had not told me. And when Meridian Bridge had required the consent signature of any co-occupant before finalizing, a standard requirement that his letter mentioned in passing, he had told them that no co-occupant's consent was required, that the property was held solely in his name, which was a lie, a deliberate, documented lie, submitted to a financial institution. I found the Meridian Bridge response letter at the back of the second drawer, filed under a folder labeled MISC Correspondence in Daniel's handwriting. The handwriting I had loved for 4 years, that I knew as well as my own. The letter said that Meridian Bridge had conducted a title search and confirmed that the property was registered solely in the name of Clara Brennan, and that as such, the company was unable to proceed with the loan on the terms submitted. It went on to say that should Mr. Caldwell wish to resubmit with a co-signatory or alternative collateral, they would be happy to review. The letter was dated 6 months ago, so he had known for 6 months that the loan had been declined. He had known for 6 months that the first plan had failed, which meant there had been a second plan, which meant there was an arrangement, which meant Victoria. I went to his laptop. He'd left it on the desk, closed but not logged out. The screen asked for a password. I sat for a moment, and then I typed the password he had used for everything when we first got together, the one he'd given me freely in those early months of shared Wi-Fi and combined streaming services. the name of his first dog and the year of his university graduation strung together. I had half expected him to have changed it. He hadn't. The email client opened. The most recent thread in the inbox was a conversation with Victoria. Subject line, revised approach, going back 4 months. I started at the bottom and read up. 4 months ago, Victoria had written proposing what she called a cleaner solution to what she referred to as the collateral situation. She had recently joined Hartwell Properties and was aware of a planned development in the Northern District, the same district where Caldwell Group's failed project sat, and there was an opportunity to restructure the deal in a way that would clear Daniel's debt and give him a stake in the Hartwell project. But the development required a specific parcel of adjacent residential land to make the density numbers work. Clara's house sat on that parcel. If the house could be acquired, by sale, voluntary, or otherwise, the whole situation could be resolved. Daniel's response had been to ask how. Victoria's reply was 3 paragraphs of careful, intelligent financial language that amounted to this: a spousal property transfer agreement signed by Clara, transferring equity in the property to Daniel, would allow him to legally offer it as collateral or arrange its sale. And if Clara were unwilling to sign, there were legal mechanisms available: renovation investment arguments, cohabitation rights, that a well-resourced legal team could use to establish a partial claim. It would take time, she noted, but the end of the month was the deadline Hartwell Properties had given before they'd proceed without the parcel and restructure the development plan entirely. The most recent email was from 3 days ago. Daniel had written, "She still doesn't know anything. I need more time." Victoria had replied in 7 words, "End of the month, Daniel. No extensions." I closed the laptop. I stood up from the desk. I walked out of his office, down the hall, into the kitchen, and I stood at the sink and gripped the cold porcelain edge with both hands and looked out the window at the garden. My garden, the one that flooded every spring. And I breathed, and I breathed, and I breathed. The shaking started in my hands and worked its way inward. Not panic, not grief, something colder and more elemental. The physical response to a world that has been quietly reorganizing itself around you without your knowledge, which has just, without warning, shown you the blueprint. The cold of it was extraordinary. It moved through me like water moving through cracks in stone, slow and inevitable. And when it had finished moving, I was very still. I was also very clear. I did not call Daniel, I called my father. My father, Martin Brennan, is a man who speaks slowly and listens completely, who spent 30 years as a civil litigation solicitor before retiring, and who has, in my experience, a nearly perfect instinct for which crises are manageable and which require a different category of response. I called him from the car, parked 2 streets away from the house, and I told him everything in the flat, organized way I'd spent the previous hour learning from the documents. When I finished, there was a silence, and then he said very quietly, "Don't touch anything else in that office. Don't confront him yet, and call Sarah Elmore. She does family and property. She's excellent, and I'll text you her number right now." "Dad," I said, and my voice did something then, just briefly, that I hadn't let it do inside the house. "I know," he said. "I know, love, but we do this right." I had an appointment with Sarah Elmore at 3 that afternoon. Sarah was a compact, precise woman in her late 40s whose office smelled of good coffee and old legal textbooks, and who had the particular gift of making catastrophic information feel manageable simply by receiving it without visible alarm. I laid everything out for her: the collateral letter, the Meridian Bridge exchange, the email chain, and she listened and took notes and occasionally asked a question so specific it made me realize she had already understood, 3 sentences ago, where the situation was going. When I finished, she set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk. "The property is yours," she said, "solely. No legal mechanism exists that compels you to transfer equity, and any renovation investment claim would take years to litigate and would almost certainly fail given the disparity in contribution. What your husband submitted to Meridian Bridge was fraudulent misrepresentation. The email chain documents a conspiracy with his former spouse to acquire your asset under duress. None of it is actionable against you. All of it is potentially actionable by you." I asked her what I should do. "Tonight," she said, "you go home, you behave as normal, and you do not tip him off. Tomorrow morning, I file for an emergency injunction preventing any transfer or encumbrance of the property. We serve him simultaneously with the injunction and a formal notice of our intention to pursue the fraudulent misrepresentation claim. At that point, the arrangement is finished." She paused. "I'm sorry," she said in a different voice. "Not about the legal situation, about the rest of it." I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. I went home, I made dinner. I asked Daniel about his day, and he told me about a planning meeting, and I listened and nodded and passed him the salad and refilled his glass, and I thought, tomorrow. And then I thought, no, tonight. Because the longer I sat there, watching him perform the ease of a man with a clean conscience, the more I understood that I could not spend another night in this house with this version of him. The version I now knew, the one who had spent 4 months composing careful emails to his ex-wife about how to legally displace me from my own home. I had the documents. Sarah had the documents. The injunction could be filed first thing tomorrow regardless. There was nothing tactical left that required my silence. I waited until he had cleared his plate and was pouring himself a second glass of wine. Relaxed, shoulders down, completely unguarded. "I found the Meridian Bridge letter," I said. The glass didn't fall, but his hand stopped moving, and the wine made a small, precise arc and landed on the tablecloth, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. He looked at me. I looked at him. I watched him try to find the shape of a response. Watched him cycle through denial, explanation, minimization, and then simply stop, like a machine that has run out of available programs. "Clara," he said. His voice was different. Stripped of the performance, just the voice of a man who has been caught completely. "I also found the emails with Victoria," I said. "All of them." He put the wine glass down. He looked at the table. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was going to find a way to what?" My voice was completely level, not raised, not shaking. I had not known I was capable of this particular register until that moment. The voice that comes from somewhere below anger, below hurt, below anything that has a temperature. To ask me to voluntarily sign away my house to cover a debt you created without telling me, or to let Victoria's legal team create enough pressure that I'd sign just to make it stop. He said nothing. He looked at his hands. "You lied to Meridian Bridge," I said. "You told them you were the sole owner of this property. That's fraud, Daniel. My solicitor used that word this afternoon, and she didn't hesitate." His head came up at the word solicitor. Something moved in his face, fear, real and unmanaged, the fear of a man who has understood that consequences are already in motion beyond his control. "Clara, please, if we can just talk about this." "I'm going to need you to leave the house tonight," I said. "You can take what you need for a few days. By the time you've found somewhere to stay, you'll have received formal notification from my solicitor's office. After that, all communication goes through her." The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and covered terrain I will not describe in detail, because the details were the unpleasant administrative reality of a marriage failing in real time. His explanations, which were genuinely coherent, and which I listened to, and which changed nothing. His attempt to recast himself as a man who had been desperate and afraid, and had made terrible choices rather than a man who had chosen, deliberately, to deceive his wife. Both things can be true at once. I let him speak. And when he had finished, I said, "I know you were afraid. I understand that the business failing felt unsurvivable, but the choice you made was to solve your problem by taking what was mine, quietly, carefully, and for a long time. That's not a mistake. That's a decision." He left at 10:30. I watched his car pull away from the front step, the taillights fading at the corner, and then there was only the quiet street and the dark garden and the sound of the house settling around me. 2 weeks later, I received a notification that Meridian Bridge Capital had filed a complaint with the Financial Conduct Authority regarding the fraudulent misrepresentation in Daniel's loan application. A week after that, Victoria Caldwell's restructuring proposal for the Hartwell Northern District project collapsed. Without my property in the parcel, the density calculations no longer worked, and the development was reconfigured at significant cost. Richard Hartwell, from what my father heard through professional circles, was quietly furious. Victoria's tenure at Hartwell Properties lasted another 6 weeks. The Caldwell Group filed for voluntary liquidation in the spring. Daniel and I divorced 13 months after the Hartwell dinner. The proceedings were, as Sarah had predicted, relatively straightforward. He had no claim on the house. He signed the papers without contesting the settlement terms, which I have always thought was the first genuinely decent thing he did in the final chapter of our marriage. I live in the house still. Alone now, which took some adjusting to. The absence of his chaos in the kitchen drawer, the running shoes no longer by the back door, the particular silence of a space that used to hold 2 people's breathing. There were months when that adjustment was genuinely hard, when I stood at the kitchen sink in the evenings and felt the weight of what had been lost. Not just the marriage, but the version of my life I had believed I was living, the story I had been telling myself about who we were to each other. That loss is real, and I don't minimize it. It cost me something I can't get back. I carry that honestly. But it is a Saturday morning in early October, and I am sitting on the back step with coffee, watching the garden in the thin autumn light, and there is something else here, too. Something I did not expect. The roses I planted last spring have come through, 5 of them along the back fence, a deep red-orange that catches the morning sun in a way that makes the whole garden look briefly lit from within. The backyard did not flood this year. The coffee is exactly right. The radiators are on for the first time this season, and the house smells like wood smoke and candles and something that is simply, purely mine. The particular warm atmosphere of a space belonging entirely to one person who has chosen, deliberately, everything in it. The fireproof box sits on the same shelf in the bedroom closet. Inside it, the title documents still carry my name, Clara Brennan, sole registered proprietor, in clean black type on the first page. They have always said that. I had just for a while forgotten to remember what it meant. Some things, once you've had to fight for them, you never stop knowing the value of. The house knows my footsteps now. It knows my hours, my rhythms, the sound of my key in the lock at the end of the day. And I know something I did not know before, the difference between trusting someone and being blind to them. The space between keeping peace and keeping yourself. That knowledge cost me something real. I carry it anyway like the key in my hand, small, specific, and entirely my own.